But you brought up something else that was very interesting to me.
Okay.
You know who else is from Springfield, Missouri?
I do not know, Jen. Please tell us.
Brad Pitt.
Oh, that's right. He went to. I don't know if I can call out certain schools. He went to Kickapoo High School, which was the rival high school of Glendale High School, which was the high school where. Well, actually, my brother went to Glendale High School.
Okay.
But yeah, he went to Kickapoo High School.
Oh, how funny!
Yeah, so
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Leave it to one of the biggest Brad Pitt fans
I'm a
that
huge
I know.
Brad Pitt fan. He's probably the only person I would be starstruck for. But
well,
so now I'm starstruck for you.
Well, before we devolve into Brad Pitt fandom. Welcome to Talk with History. I'm your host, Scott, here with my wife and historian, Jen.
Hello.
On this podcast, we give you insights to our history-inspired world travels, YouTube channel journey, and examine history through deeper conversations with the curious, the explorers, and the history lovers out there. And today, we are chatting with Jared from the Daily Bellringer YouTube channel. Welcome, Jared.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Good. And now before, Jared, we start emptying our glasses or anyone listening, I want to ask our listeners to help us out by leaving us a review in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or feel free to reach out to us at thehistorybuzz.com. And don't forget to check out our other podcast, Talk with History, where Jen and I dive deeper into our Walk with History videos and give you a behind-the-scenes look at our history-based YouTube journey. Now, today's guest, Jared, is the host of the Daily Bellringer, a YouTube channel that tries to provide videos to help students shift their minds from their previous class or subject to the history lesson of the day. So from what I've seen, these approximately 5-minute videos are the perfect bite-sized history snack to get anyone from thinking about geometry and the Pythagorean theorem to the Roaring '20s or World War I. How you doing today, Jared?
Mm-hmm. Good. I was going to say, you said we were going to have drinks, and I guess I did not bring anything down here with me. So I should have my big glass of milk here with me.
I know. I have my Diet Coke.
It's all good. It's all good. Yeah. It's up to everyone. I think maybe one out of our first 3 interviews had something to drink with them, so don't worry about it. But so Jared, can you give us a little bit of background on kind of where you're from, how you kind of grew up and kind of grew into your passion for history, and then kind of how that branched eventually into the Daily Bellringer?
Well, honestly, I got a couple stories here I'll share with you about kind of how I got into history. Actually, it's kind of cool. You're talking about, that my videos are kind of focused on being used in the classroom. And actually here over the past few weeks, it's been really cool because a lot of schools are winding down, which of course my views start going way down when school's out. But what's cool too is I have some teachers that have contacted me that want me to visit their classes. And so I've been able to virtually visit classes from Texas to California to Florida, and everything. And so it's really cool to get to connect with students that are, hundreds of miles away from me and everything.
Oh,
so
that's awesome.
That's been really cool. I'm located in central Illinois, and but actually I grew up in southwest Missouri, near Springfield, Missouri, is where I grew up. And I'll give you 2 stories here of kind of how I got into history. Probably one of my most vivid memories of how I got into history was just outside of Springfield, Missouri. There is the Battle of Wilson's Creek. It was August 10th, 1861, one of the very early battles in the war, fighting for control of that border state of Missouri. And Union troops led by General Nathaniel Lyon had marched down from St. Louis to basically secure the southwest part of the state. And so, we have this battle that takes place down there. A lot of the Missouri State Guard and everything fighting against Union troops. Of course, it was just a complete mess because it was so early in the war that neither side really knew what they were doing. But interestingly, Nathaniel Lyon, he gets killed in the battle. He's actually the first general to be killed in the Civil War there at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. But anyway, when I was a kid, my parents took me and one of my best friends out there to Wilson's Creek and basically just dropped us off and told us just go run around for a few hours and we'll be back to pick you up later.
That's awesome.
And so, I mean, I of course, we were 10-year-old kids. We loved it that our parents just were giving us the independence to go out there.
Absolutely.
But I remember we went hiking up on Bloody Hill, which is where Nathaniel Lyon was shot down. Wow. And we got up there and there was this great big sinkhole. And so, of course, we're 10-year-old boys. What do you think we're going to do?
Swim.
We're like, we jump down in this sinkhole. We start rolling around, running up and down each side for about half an hour.
Sure.
We're there just goofing around in this sinkhole. And so then we come hiking down from Bloody Hill down to the visitor center, and we find the park ranger, and we're like, hey, what's up with that big sinkhole up there on Bloody Hill? And he said, oh, well, that's where they had 40 Union soldiers buried right after the battle. It was a mass grave in this sinkhole. And I suppose to me that made such an impact on me at 10 years old that here I had been running around and playing in this, what was a mass grave after the battle. And so, that made such an impact on me that then I was like, well, why in the world did these guys go here to fight? Why were they willing to die? Why did they bury them in a mass grave? All that stuff started kind of piquing my interest about history. So again, I'm like many, many other people, Civil War history is, really what I'm really focused on. And that's, when I teach it in class, my students, I teach 7th and 8th grade American history. They just, I think they roll their eyes because I'll just go on for weeks and weeks and weeks about the Civil War. And, I try to zoom through the Revolution and the other stuff. So that way I can get to the Civil War and spend most of my time on that. That's one big reason why I'm into history. But then 2, I have an older brother, Jason, he's a bigger history nerd than I am. Okay. And he should honestly be teaching a history class, but he doesn't, because he would be phenomenal, because honestly, 90% of what I know about history seems like it comes from conversations with him. But when we were growing up, my dad, every time we'd go on vacation, he would take us to some sort of historic site, whether it be like Vicksburg or stopping at Gettysburg or Antietam or, just basically anything that was historic. He would stop and take us there. And my brother and I were talking about this a few years ago, and we're like, why on earth did Dad take us to all these historic sites? Because Dad didn't care about history. He could care less about all this stuff. But yet he took us to these sites and it got us all interested in history. Well, it dawned on us the reason he did that on vacation was because he was cheap. Because he didn't take us to Disney World. Sure. He was like, you know what? I can go to this historic site for free and I can entertain my kids for a few hours without having to pay anything. So it's honestly, my father's cheapness is kind of what led me to really get into history and really love history so much and everything. So that's how I always tell people I got into history, was kind of, those 2 stories kind of led me down the path of eventually becoming a history teacher.
How funny is that? It's funny. We were just telling you, we did an interview a couple days ago, and for him, the JD, from the History Underground, for him it was family too, right? For him it was his grandfather and his father. But how funny that it's still family. And I'll be curious to see how our kids end up falling out, whether they love it or hate it, because we drag them everywhere.
They go to all of our
family locations.
I always see in your videos, your kids are in the background back there, usually, hanging out while you're recording your videos. So yeah, that's awesome that you're taking your kids there, because I'm sure someday they'll probably look back and be like, remember how fun it was to go to all those sites? And I'm sure when they're in school too, I bet they probably say to the teacher, hey, I've been there. Yeah. I know where you're talking about.
Yeah. They would ask about Rosa Parks, and I'm like, we were there. I took you there to where she got on the bus. And they were like, oh yeah. But you brought up something else that was very interesting to me.
Okay.
You know who else is from Springfield, Missouri?
I do not know, Jen. Please tell us.
Brad Pitt.
Oh, that's right. He went to, I don't know if I can call out certain schools. He went to Kickapoo High School, which was the rival high school of Glendale High School, which was the high school where, well, actually, my brother went to Glendale High School. Okay. But yeah, he went to Kickapoo High School.
So, how funny.
So
that's awesome.
Yeah. Leave it to one of the biggest Brad Pitt fans that I know.
Brad Pitt fan. He's probably the only person I would be starstruck for. But so now I'm starstruck for you.
Well, before we devolve into Brad Pitt fandom, I'm going to
tell me more about the channel. Do you want to say anything about the Daily Bellringer?
So talk to us. So how did all that kind of eventually develop into the Daily Bellringer?
Okay, yeah. So the Daily Bellringer, the way it all started, actually, I told you before, I'm a teacher. I've taught for, now I forget how many years. It's like 15, 16 years I've been teaching. Yeah. But a few years ago, I was asked to become an instructional coach. My district kind of recognized, they were like, hey, here's one of our better teachers. Cool. Why don't we have him go and help other teachers out to become better teachers? Yeah. And so I went to be an instructional coach. Well, when I went to do that, they didn't really have anybody to fill in American history. And so they just said, well, here's an English teacher. Let's just have her do it. And so I had an English teacher that I worked with, and she was just completely distraught, crying, because she was like, I've taught English for 20 years and here they are putting me into an American history class.
Oh my gosh.
Which again, I have a problem with that in education, that we throw people just into whatever subject area just because they have a teaching degree. Sure. But anyway, she was so upset about it. And I started thinking to myself, well, what could I do to help her out? And so I was like, what if I made just little 5-minute videos with a few questions with them that she could maybe just show at the beginning of her class to just get the basics. And then she could maybe go on with a reading or something else that related to that topic. Yeah. And so initially I just started making the videos just for one teacher in my school district. And so once I made a couple dozen videos, then my wife kind of said to me, it was like, well, why are you making them just for this one teacher? Why don't you just put it out there for everybody to see? Awesome. And so that's when I started putting it out there. And of course, if you see some of my very early videos, they're nowhere close to like what I do now with my videos, but it's just kind of, just like I'm sure you found with your videos, it just kind of keeps on growing and you feel like you keep getting better at it and you keep finding new ways to do it. And that's kind of how it all kind of got rolling and everything. And of course, once I started putting them out there, like I said, now it's like I have schools in Guam and in South Korea that have contacted me, that are using some of the stuff in their classes. And so, the whole focus of my channel, it's not to get every single detail of all these events. I know you guys do a great job of going deep into the topics and sharing a lot of stuff. But my videos, I kind of look at them as being, this is just simply to kind of tee up the ball for the teacher, then to hit it out of the park, that they can, give them the basics and then follow it up with like, okay, here's a primary source reading that goes along with it. Or we're going to start working on this little activity where you're, role playing or something after they watch the video. So that's really the main goal of my videos. They're not to cover everything. They're just to give the basics and everything.
And when you had reached out, because we actually got connected to you for the listeners here, right? Mm-hmm. So you actually had reached out to us saying, hey, I would love to do an interview with you. This is my channel, and kind of some other resources, right? Trying to kind of push some other history resources and stuff like that out there. And I looked at your channel and we kind of emailed back and forth. I was like, what a cool idea! Like I think that's such a great idea to like quick bite-sized history. And I love the concept of like, it is tough for students to kind of shift that brain set. And so if they can sit down and kind of, like you said, either as they're coming into class, you push play on the video, or the first 5 minutes, it kind of gets them into that mind frame. Mm-hmm. So I love that.
Yes, me too.
And I know I'm speaking to you as, I don't know if you guys have ever taught any classes or anything, but like when you're working, especially with like junior high age kids, it's like you really need to have a set routine that you do every day that kind of gets them comfortable when they come into the classroom. And I feel like my videos are kind of that little routine. You could just simply put one of those on right when they come in the room. Yep. They know they need to answer the questions, and then it just kind of gets everything rolling for your class. So that's honestly kind of, what the goal is of the channel and everything.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. And a quick congratulations to you before we move on. You just crossed 10,000 subscribers.
Yeah.
My kids at school, they were saying they wanted me to shave my beard or something like when I hit 10,000. I was like, no, I'm not doing that.
Not going to happen. Well, I saw that. I was scouting your channel a little bit earlier today, and I saw that. And congratulations, man. We're striving to get there. We'll maybe we'll do a little something once we get closer to that mark. So,
all
right. It's a slow process, but yeah,
that's what we keep saying. It's you have to be in for the marathon.
Yeah,
it's not a sprint.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm sorry if I'm changing topics here. But the other day I was watching a talk by there's a guy I follow named Lou Mongello, who's like a big like Disney World like historian, but he has some great stuff about like podcasting and social media that he has as well. And he brought up the point that I think you're kind of in the same boat as I am. It's like this is something that you really love to do.
Yes.
And it's like, does it really matter necessarily that you have 10,000 subscribers or 100,000 subscribers? Mm-hmm. As long as, if you just have 2 people out there that are watching consistently, it makes it all worth it. That you're just like, you're sharing what you're passionate about. And so you just need to stay passionate about what you're doing. And, 100%. For me personally, I've found that, these videos are just something that I get really passionate about, that I'm willing to, get up, at 4 a.m. so I can get them done before I go to work and, things like that. So, so I'm sure you guys are kind of in that same boat, that it's something you're passionate about and you just want to keep doing it.
Yeah. For us, it's something we found we could really do together.
Yeah.
And that's, because I think I've told you before, Jared, like I do the information and the topics, but Scott does all the production.
Yeah.
So together we're the team. So that's what makes it great. It's a real family thing for us.
Yeah, I joke. I joke with folks, right? And to anybody that doesn't know us, is I'm not really a huge history buff myself. I'm just not, right? But I've learned to enjoy it and doing these things, and I enjoy the production side of it. And so I joke with Jen is that we finally found something after 15 years that we enjoy doing together. So yeah, it's a ton of fun, and I can tell you're doing it for you have the heart to do it for other people, and I think that'll give you some longevity. So let's shift into kind of our first real segment here. And so what I like to do is we do this is just kind of for fun, but it leads into a historical topic. Is we do a word association game. So I'm gonna say some words, and you just kind of say the first thing or phrase that pops into your mind, and believe it or not, eventually it will lead into to a historical event that we'll chit chat about a little bit. So,
all right.
So the first word I have for you is Kansas.
I'd say Jayhawks.
Okay.
And I said Dorothy because I thought Wizard of Oz.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
So if I was to say 9-0, what would you think?
9-0. I guess I'm thinking of a baseball game when I hear that. Like 9-0.
Yeah, I said the same thing. I said a football score.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I were to say unequal, what would you think?
I'm thinking of, I suppose because I teach history and the Constitution, I'm thinking about representation. That's basically the word that popped into my mind was, you said unequal. I said representation.
Okay.
And I thought of the uneven bars in gymnastics.
If I was to say brown, what would you think?
Oh, John.
Okay.
Okay. And
John
I thought
Brown.
of Cleveland Browns.
Browns, right? Pittsburgh fan over here.
I know.
If I was to say Supreme Court, what would you think?
Oh, the first word that comes into my mind is justice.
Okay. All right. And so if we're kind of putting all those together, what I'm leading into is Brown versus the Board of Education. And so if you look back on all of that stuff, right, it's actually the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. 9-0 was unanimous decision, unequal, Brown and Supreme Court. So that's just kind of a fun way to kind of to see if we kind of lead folks down a path, and then once you get to the end, it's just a fun way to kind of broach a topic. So one of the things that we like to do.
I have to be honest with you.
Go ahead.
I have to be honest, since I said I'm so into Civil War history. As soon as you started saying Kansas, then I said Jayhawks, and then I started thinking bleeding Kansas. And of course, that led me into thinking of John Brown and everything. So that was what I was,
Yeah, I wasn't even when he did it to me the first time. I wasn't even on the same page. And then when he said Brown versus the Board of Education, I'm like, wow, was that in Kansas? Like I knew it was somewhere.
Yeah.
Yep.
But Southern, but I wasn't sure. That was something I was not aware of. So
yeah, so that's what we like to ask, right? And that's really more the focus of this podcast is how we learn history, what we remember learning. So what we like to ask is, what do you remember learning of Brown versus Board of Education, either in your youth or what kind of stands out to you now, looking back? That again stands out today that maybe didn't when you were younger.
Well, I think overall, just as you get older, you get a better grasp of what history is and what those events were. And I guess, when you're in junior high and high school, and it's tough to try to get students to recognize that something is unfair because again, students so many times are, I don't know how to want to say like narcissists, everything's about them and about their whole world. And they don't think about people outside of their world. And, thinking about Brown versus Board of Education, I mean, that's something that, as a junior high student, you probably don't think, we're like, that's no big deal. I don't really want to go to school anyway. So why would you be concerned about if you couldn't go to school? Sure. But then as you get older, you recognize you're like, wow, that's really that's really unfair. That's really a terrible law that's in place. And it's a great thing that we were able to overturn that and everything. And actually just recently, like you were saying, Jen, you don't think about Brown versus Board of Education being in Kansas because you automatically defer to like Jim Crow laws and you think, well, that's deep South.
Yes.
So Brown versus Board of Education, that had to be like in Mississippi or something like that. And you just don't think about it, being in Kansas. And that's the unfortunate fact. And of course, I apologize for still focusing on antebellum history and Civil War history. But
no worries.
That's something that I try to stress to my students is that racism just didn't exist in southern states.
Yes.
It existed everywhere.
Everywhere.
And that people in the North in the antebellum period were just as racist as people in the South, unfortunately.
Yes.
And of course, we talk about amendments and how, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. But I said, unfortunately, we can't outlaw stupidity and we can't outlaw things like racism. We simply can't because people still can hold those wrong views and everything. And so yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of what I think about when I think about Brown versus Board of Education. I have to be honest with you. Honestly, my teaching, I pretty much go through basically Reconstruction, and I don't really get a whole lot further than that with my students. So honestly, I've never really had an opportunity to teach in my classroom Brown versus Board of Education. So really, most of my memories of that is just kind of some of my classes from when I was in high school.
Yeah.
Yes.
Me too.
I probably think of it as the South because the best depiction I've ever seen of it was at the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. And it's because they made a white classroom melt into an African-American classroom, like a black classroom. It was one classroom and they did one side of it white and one side of it black. And the whole premise of Board versus the Education was separate but equal, but they're trying to show you how it was never equal. Like that was the whole thing. Like it's supposed to be equal, but here's this white classroom, nice desks, new things. Everything was painted nicely, and then it melted into benches. No desks, benches. Nothing's new. Everything's old and used, and nothing's painted. Everything looks like it's been kind of, put together haphazardly. And these are the two classrooms that were operating at the same time in the same city, and with the whole separate but equal mentality. And that to me was one of the best depictions to see how this was not. There was no equality here.
Yeah, and one of the things, right? Yeah. Again, not being super focused on history when I was growing up, but I was a political science major, in college. So one of my favorite classes was actually some of my constitutional law classes, and I actually enjoyed, in a weird way, reading some of those Supreme Court decisions that we would study about some of these bigger, more well-known cases, because these Supreme Court justices are so smart. I mean, they are brilliant lawyers and judges, and the way they write is not only eloquent but so well put. And I liked the phrase when I was kind of refreshing my memory on this topic was, separate but equal is inherently not equal, right? And that's kind of how that's how they phrased it, and I like that. I love that aspect of some of those things. But again, I'm like you guys. I don't really remember too much about it. I learned about it, right, and learning separate but equal and things like that.
Well, as I say, one thing I try to emphasize to my students, because, we go through like the Dred Scott case. And, I make the point that it's like we trust the Supreme Court and we think that, these guys are brilliant lawyers. And they're the top of their field, but they don't always make the right decision. Just because the Supreme Court says that this is the right decision. It can be. So, if you go back and look at Plessy versus Ferguson, when they established the whole separate but equal
the whole
idea,
thing, where it came from.
That was an absolute, that was an absolutely ridiculous decision. And and I say to the students, and I'm very much an advocate in the classroom, not to share my own political views, but, I say, there's several decisions the Supreme Court has made that I don't necessarily agree with, personally. And, but I don't necessarily get into those, but I say, you don't always have to agree with what the Supreme Court says or what the government says. That's one of the great freedoms we have here in the United States, that we can have our own opinions.
That's a great point. And I think that's a great point of clarification is there are smart people out there who are intending to do good things, but there's an evolution, as we know, right? As you guys who study history and me who learns history through making these videos and podcasts and all that stuff. But there's an evolution, right? I mean, sometimes it's societal, sometimes it's cultural.
Yes.
It's a mix of everything. So a historian 100 years ago, right, would have a very different opinion on what's right, what's wrong, what's equal, what's not equal.
Yes.
A very different perspective on history than we do today. So there's, to your point, Jared, there's always going to be an evolution.
Yes.
Even at the highest levels.
Yes. And, and that's what I feel like you, Jared, like I always try to stress that America has never spiked the ball. We've never gotten to the ideal we try to live by. We're trying to get there. That's the whole process, is we're trying to meet these ideals. And it's the ever going process of that. And sometimes we take a step forward and sometimes we take a step back and we try to fix it. And, sometimes that takes time, but it's the whole experiment of trying to reach that ideal that makes it worth it.
Yeah, and the thing is, too, you got to think about, we're never going to reach that goal because the fact is we're all flawed human beings.
Yep.
We all have, twisted things in our, and this is like, no matter how hard we try, I don't think we're ever going to, we're never going to be able to reach that because it's simply impossible. We're all flawed and everything. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yes.
But it just means, we're getting very philosophical.
I know.
We are. We're getting into the stuff that I like to talk about because I love that kind of
stuff.
Well,
then the other thing, also, Scott, I guess what you got me thinking of there is how much, and again, this is something like sometimes I try to bring this up with some of my higher classes and see if we can kind of talk about it a little bit. But it's like, how much do we hold people in the past responsible for their actions?
We've talked about that.
Because it's like, it's like there's terrible, terrible things people have done in history. But at the time when they did those things were acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, can we necessarily, as us today, go back and say, well, this person was a terrible, evil person, when at the time period, they didn't necessarily see themselves that way, or other people in society didn't see them that way. So I don't know. It's one of those things that I don't know if there's a right answer or wrong answer to it. It's just one of those ones that just kind of makes you think. You know?
And I think that's the best part, Jared. Like, so I've taught a couple classes too. I always lead off. I'm going to tell you about the most amazing, heroic people in American history, and I'm going to tell you about these terrible, terrible moments and evil things. And sometimes it's going to be the same person. And I said, and the point is, you're not here to really judge them, but you're here to know them. You're here to understand what happened. Mm-hmm. You're here to understand those decisions. And I think you feel the same way, Jared. Like, I'm here to teach you how to find the information, what primary sources to look at. Make sure you're looking at the whole picture. Make sure you're not cutting stuff out just to see a person a certain way or an event a certain way. But I'm not here to tell you what to think, just how to think. Mm-hmm. And the what is very individual to the person. So
yeah, and for me, right, when she's providing that, what I'm trying to do from a production and kind of, I'll say it in a weird way, kind of an artistic sense, is provide the context and the story. Because I will say that one thing that I've kind of learned more over the past little over a year now that we've been doing our channel is that there's a whole lot of context that gets lost just kind of over the course of how much education we're trying to shove into all of our young brains, for 12 years and then 4 more years in college and all that stuff, right? So there's a whole lot of context when you're learning history that just kind of gets lost because you can't cover it all.
Yes.
And so that's one of the things that we do our best to do. To your point, we've got 8-minute videos for us is on the short end, right? We just published a 15-minute video on the Wright brothers, today.
Yes.
And we're getting ready to do, another one on a Medal of Honor winner and stuff like that. And so it's hard to get that context in there, but it's so important if you really want to understand a topic or a subject.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of both what you guys are talking about. So
and that's the difficult thing in teaching history is, you think about the math teacher down the hall.
Yeah.
Their textbook kind of just stays the same.
Yeah.
Sure. Not a whole lot of change, not a whole lot changes.
Yeah.
But, history, it's like, we got stuff, ancient history that always going to be there. But the fact is we're constantly adding to it. We're constantly adding to our history. And so it's constantly growing. So like you said, it's like, most teachers today, even in high school, I think, they're lucky to get through Vietnam.
Sure.
Just because it's like there's so much stuff you have to cover. And like you said, you can't cover all those little minute details that are actually pretty important when you look at the big picture. But as in a high school classroom, it's like you got to get through this to this certain point by the end of the year. And so you kind of have to just breeze over those things. And I think, your videos do a great job of bringing out some of those little details that sometimes we miss and everything. So yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of the goals with my videos too. Sometimes I try to throw in some of those things so that way they can get a little 5-minute video and there it is.
Yeah.
With some of those little details.
Connect the dots.
Yeah. Like extra little nugget, little flavor on there. So, well, and that's actually kind of, that's a decent segue kind of into the next question that we like to ask folks. And actually, you had kind of touched on it earlier when you talked about your students and kind of how when you're young, you tend to be, for lack of a better word, narcissistic, right? It's your world is yourself, right? So one of the things we like to ask our guests is, what's the first big historical event that you remember happening in your lifetime that kind of really opened your eyes to like, oh my gosh, like I'm not the center of the universe here. So what's something like that a big kind of historical event that you remember?
Honestly, I remember I was sitting in the hallway at Pershing Elementary School in Springfield, and I was doing flashcards with one of my friends.
Yeah.
We're just doing like 2 + 2 and 3 + 3. I was in 2nd grade, and the teacher like came out in the hallway and was like, "You guys need to come back in the classroom." And on the screen, the Challenger had just exploded.
Yeah.
And so that was like my first, and I know I was only 2nd grade, but really that's the first time I really remember like, oh my goodness, here's a huge event. And I remember in school that year, we had all been following Krista McCullough and how she was going to be on that flight. She was going to be the first teacher to go into space. Yeah. And how, we had been following that, and here it was this huge tragedy. And so that's honestly probably the first time I can remember an event that like, I guess kind of shocked the system or whatever and made me realize, there's bigger things than just me. So it was probably 2nd grade.
Yeah. Do you think that your students have had anything like that?
Honestly, I don't really feel like they necessarily have.
Because, I'm not sure.
Of course, every year, we spend the day when it was September 11th, I spend the day trying to talk to them about it. And of course, when I get to September 11th with my classes, it's kind of different because I can actually tell them, I'm like, everything we've talked about so far this year, I've been a secondary source.
Right.
I haven't been somebody who was actually there that experienced it. Mm-hmm. But now here's an event where I'm a primary source, even though I wasn't in New York City or Washington, D.C. when those things happened. I was still there and I remember that day going out in my front yard and looking up in the sky, and I could see Air Force One and a couple jets.
Oh my gosh.
They were the only planes in the sky over my house.
Oh, wow.
And that was just an eerie feeling, just looking up and seeing that. But, again, I feel like, I hope they don't have to go through an event like that to kind of make them recognize, how important history is and how there's a bigger world than just them. I hope they don't have to experience something like 9/11. But yeah, I really don't feel like our younger generation today has really had an event like that has, been a moment where all the nation comes together and, recognizes one single event.
Yeah, I said something. I actually kind of said.
I don't know how you guys feel.
No,
I feel the same way. Like you would think COVID would have done it, but COVID really divided the nation more than bring us together.
I would guess, and that's actually a really good point. I would guess that in 10 years, if I ask my currently 11-year-old, if I ask him, hey, what's kind of the first big thing that you remember, the big historical event, or maybe in 20 years, right? Because that's, if he's anything like me, he won't start really being that in perspective until he's almost 30.
He's a little oblivious.
And, but I COVID might be one of those things, the world pandemic, right? When everything shut down, and that might be the thing, right? That's actually a really good point, Jen. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, but honestly, we kind of guarded them from bigger. Because we saw the bigger picture living through it, that the world wasn't really, because when you've been through 9/11 and saw how we all came together, and to see something like COVID, we really didn't. And we guarded our children a little bit more, so maybe they felt like we did,
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really good point. I'm surprised I hadn't thought about that earlier. But it may be
9/11
the one.
was just such a bam moment.
Yeah.
It was just one boom. Here it is.
Yes.
Whereas COVID was just kind of slowly.
It was gradual.
Slowly.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
I realized we kind of saw it coming, then all of a sudden it's like, shut down,
Yes.
shut down, but still it just kind of drug on. But I think you're right. I think probably for a lot of these kids, 10 years from now, this will be probably the COVID pandemic.
They'll say, hey, the pandemic, I remember the pandemic.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Jared, you said the shuttle, because that's mine too. The Challenger explosion is mine. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's the first time, same thing. My school followed it. I went to school in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so my school did the same thing, followed the whole thing. We watched it on TV, and it was the first time I was like, this is what's happening, right?
Do you remember like talking to your parents about it or anything? Or like did your family kind of like discuss it? Or was it really more just like, hey, I was at school and this was just like a complete shock? And I mean, you had some very specific details that you remember about that day. So obviously that's one of those things.
I more just remember that moment being in the hallway and having the teacher call us back into the room.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily remember really discussing it that much with my parents or anything. So no, I don't.
The aftermath.
I guess I don't really have that memory, but
but
I need to talk to I don't know if you're like me, your sibling seems to always remember everything better than you did.
That's
when you were
true.
A kid. So
I have one of those.
I need to call my brother.
Me of that.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah.
I tend to, my brother and I we tend to remember a lot of the same stuff. Yeah. We're very similar in that regard. But the Challenger was not one for me. I'm a little bit younger, so I wasn't quite in school yet.
So what was yours then?
So for me, it was a local thing, and we'll get into that. But for me, it was a local thing, and so it was actually because I grew up in California. And so it was actually an earthquake. Okay. And it was a pretty good sized earthquake. And actually it was in 1989. And if you're a baseball fan at all, it was the World Series.
San Francisco. I'm sorry.
It was San Francisco's and the Giants and the A's when the earthquake happened during the World Series. Or I don't remember what game it was. But I lived close enough to the San Francisco area at the time that I actually felt it was either aftershocks or kind of the first wave. Yes. And both my brother and I, we were pretty young. And that's kind of the first thing that I remember. And we joke.
Oh, that story is so great. So Scott's a pastor's kid, right? His dad's a pastor. Okay. And they thought Jesus was coming back.
Yeah. Like, we had so much church and God in our house that we were playing basically like in a pool that had been filled in with sand because it was the 80s. And right in the 80s, skateboarding became a thing, and the people weren't using their pools, and there actually used to be skaters. Like this was, just like you see in the old 80s and 90s movies, they would come and skate in the empty pool at my neighbor's yard and all that stuff. And so the neighbor moved in, and they didn't want that, and so they filled it in with sand. And so to me and my brother, we were like, great, this is our own private sandbox. And so we were playing in this pool filled with sand. And all of a sudden, the earthquake starts coming, and I thought it was like I was young enough. I thought it was just like a big truck or something driving by. We kind of lived near some farmland, but really, what it was the earthquake, and the sand was hovering probably a good inch or two off the ground, and just everything was shaking. Wow. And so both my brother and I, we got up, we ran home, and it was either me and my brother were like, "Is Jesus coming?" And my mom just wanted to make sure that we're safe, right? So we always laugh about that. So that's for me. That was the first time the first thing that I remember, and it was a little bit more regional. So that's a good segue into our next question. Is we like to ask some regional history questions because that tends to be a little bit more unique. So what's something for you that's a regional, it doesn't have to be like an eye-opening thing, but a piece of regional history that if I were to come visit you in Illinois, everybody in the local area would be like, oh yeah, we remember this kind of little historical piece of Illinois history or whatever's more local to you. And I would probably have never heard of it.
Well, I think we were talking before we started recording here.
Yeah.
Honestly, where I live in Galesburg, Illinois, it's the Lincoln Douglas debate site.
Yep.
I suppose that's maybe not the earth-shattering history for everybody when they come to this area, but if there's somebody who comes here and it's like, well, what do you have here that's historic?
Yeah,
I always point them to that. So Lincoln Douglas debate site on the campus of Knox College here in Galesburg, Illinois. And I want to say October, and I can't remember the exact date, October 1858. Was when, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate there.
Cool.
People always forget about, they think about the Lincoln. I don't know if you guys have studied the Lincoln Douglas debates very much, but of course, Abraham Lincoln was completely unknown before he challenged Stephen Douglas. And of course, Stephen Douglas was the leading senator in the Senate. Yep. And so when he challenges him and they arrange these debates, it's kind of the first time that we see candidates actually getting up in front of an audience and facing off with one another.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about those debates, and sorry, I'm going to start getting into the whole debate thing.
Sure.
Those
Great.
debates, it was like, and I forget the format. Today we think of like Trump and Hillary yelling at each other on national news.
Yeah.
But back then it was the first candidate got to get up and talk for an hour and a half. Then the next candidate would get up and talk for an hour. Then the other one would get up for like 45 minutes. And then the other one would get up for 30 minutes. It was like an all day, like 4 or 5 hour event when they would have these debates. But the funny thing is here in Galesburg, they had it at Knox College, and there's a park right across the street from this old main building at Knox College. They intended on having it in the park because they were like, we can accommodate the 20,000 people who are going to come for this in the park. Well, the thing was, the night before they had a big storm and it was too muddy to have it in the park. And so they moved it to the end of this building at Knox College. And so they built this platform on the end of the building for the candidates to stand up on. Well, they built it, and then they realized we didn't build steps for anybody to get on top of the platform.
Oh, no.
And so the only way to get on the platform was you had to climb through a window of the Knox College old main building to get onto the platform.
That's awesome.
And so the story is that when they climb out this window, Abraham Lincoln comes out and immediately stands up and says, "Finally, I've gone through college," was what he said, because he had never went to college.
Sure.
And so that was his. They say Lincoln was the king of dad jokes, and so that was his joke when he got out of the window. So anyway, but again, the Lincoln Douglas debate, one of them taking place here, and of course Lincoln loses that election to Stephen Douglas, but it thrust him into the national spotlight, and it leads to him getting the Republican nomination a couple years later. So it is kind of cool to think about the fact that, here it is, kind of Podunk, Illinois, kind of where I live at, but yet here's this site that was an instrumental step leading to arguably the greatest president in American history, getting to the presidency and leading us through the Civil War and everything. So that's always, I have a Bellringer video, one of my older ones that I recorded from on location right there at the Lincoln Douglas debate site.
I have to watch that one.
I probably should update that video because it's one of my older ones, but it's just it's a cool thing to go down there and be able to see, where everything happened and all that. So that's probably the regional thing for me in my town, what I have.
Yeah. And when you mention it, right, I'm very good at like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar, right? That's how my brain works. But I wouldn't be able to tell you, too much more about, when Lincoln was coming on to the national scene. But that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this question is we've had the chance to talk to a few folks so far and more in the future, that are kind of all around the country, and hopefully it'll expand from there. But it's really neat to hear that super local history that it's super common for everybody in town probably knows, like, oh yeah, that's it over there. It's the Lincoln Douglas. They had their debate over there, and that's a big deal. And that's when kind of Lincoln burst onto the scene right here, and it's always neat for me to learn that, as I get older and I start to appreciate it.
And I think it's great to show American history is everywhere.
Yeah.
Even in little towns, they do have a major influence. Even your little town had a major influence. And like you said, arguably the greatest president we have ever had. Like there was a moment there. And there wasn't a likability to Lincoln. And he was able to deliver his ideas well. That's why there's a whole Gettysburg Address, like one of the shortest, 272 words, but one of the greatest speeches ever given. Right? He's able to deliver his words in such a way that makes such an impact. That's one of the ways he comes onto the scene so fast and gets so much popularity. And I think that's amazing that even there he can. And wasn't he born in Illinois? No, he's born in Kentucky, but he's buried in Illinois.
Kentucky. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's buried in Springfield, Springfield, Illinois.
Yes.
So, but yeah, when you think about Lincoln too, I think what's fascinating is that he's such an iconic figure. I mean, he dies at the exact height of his career.
Yes.
And, of course, there's so much what if he had survived, would he still be remembered the way he is? But, when you think about Lincoln, you just think, oh, well, he's always been an iconic American whatever, American icon, American hero, whatever you want to say. But honestly, when you look at his career, he lost election after election after election. And for most of his career, he was a failure in politics. And I mean, he was a good lawyer, but he was a failure in politics. And honestly, nobody knew who he was until about 2 years before he gets elected president. And then, in the matter of 6 years from 1858, 7 years until 1865 when he dies, it's really only 7 years of American history that he's really instrumental, but he's instrumental at arguably the most important point in American history.
Yes,
and so yeah, I think it's fascinating to think about that.
It is, and it's fascinating to think that really half of the country hates him. When he's president, he is kind of like hated by half of the country. Like even when I go to the South, sometimes Lincoln doesn't have the best reputation in the South. And I'm always surprised by that, I guess. And I guess I shouldn't be. But it's interesting, that to be the president of this country and to know that you're really trying to bring this country together, but there are people who really don't even view you as the president. Like he never got, I feel, President Lincoln, he never got to live in how we see him today, right? He never got to feel that from the country, right? The way we look at him today, the way we are appreciative of what he did for America in his time, he never got to feel that from America. It was like, what did he have? Like 4 days after the war?
Oh yeah, it was like like literally 5 days after Lee surrenders. Have you guys been to Springfield, Illinois before?
No.
I know since you travel quite a bit and everything. Have you been? You have to go to the Lincoln Presidential Library. It is hands down the coolest historic site I've ever been to. I mean, I know a lot of historic people kind of rip on it because they're like, it's Disney meets history. Hey. But they really, they have special effects and lights and all kinds of stuff.
That's cool.
I'll take students there and they think it's just the most amazing thing. But they have this really cool display there. You walk down this hallway and all of the hallway is like all the angles of the room are like skewed and there's like these weird lights and everything. But all over the room are all these like weird abstract like shaped frames. And in each frame is a political cartoon ripping on Abraham Lincoln. And you kind of see how when he was president, people hated him.
Yes.
That, he didn't get to see that he was so loved and that he had done so many great things. And throughout his whole presidency, you just see, like they say, how we don't think about Abraham Lincoln having, other politicians in the newspapers and media attacking him. And when you look at what he really had to go through, it was nothing but attacks.
Nothing,
on the whole
constant.
time he was president. Yeah.
If
you ever get the chance to go there, you need to check it out. It's an awesome place to visit.
I would love to do that. That's probably something on our list. I uncovered some unique Abraham Lincoln history. I don't know if you ever watched that second Arlington video I made, Jared, but Ichabod Crane's son. So Washington Irving served with a man named Ichabod Crane, and that's where he got the name for his protagonist in Legends of Sleepy Hollow.
Cartoon, yeah.
But his son is buried in Arlington, and his son was a doctor in the Union Army. And when President Lincoln is shot, his son is the attending physician across the street in the Peterson House. Dr. Crane.
Really?
Yes. And he is there when President Lincoln dies.
Yeah, it was just
now,
like
he wasn't the Surgeon General, was he? At the time, I forget.
He might. I
don't remember. He was a general. I don't know if he was the surgeon. I can't remember.
But there's a couple.
I forget what the Surgeon General.
Yeah. But isn't that crazy?
Well, I forget what the Surgeon General's name was. Yeah, but I always tell my students this story. I know it's really gross and everything. This story, but. They say the Surgeon General, and I can't even think of his name off the top of my head. He comes to the Peterson House after Lincoln gets shot. And of course, standard procedure back then, since they had just been through the Civil War, standard procedure was you stuck your finger in the bullet wound to see how deep the bullet was, to be able to see if you could get it out. And so they say the Surgeon General came in, no gloves, completely bare hand, put his finger right into the bullet hole. And they say he actually pushed the bullet deeper into Lincoln's head. Yeah. And that actually he probably sped Lincoln's death by doing that. And I forget where I read that.
Barnes, Joseph Barnes really was gross. His. Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah. Okay. Joseph Barnes was the Surgeon General. So Crane must have been just like an attending who was there with him. But Jared, that's the same because I worked at the James Garfield house. I did an internship at the James Garfield house, and so same thing when James Garfield was assassinated. and he lingers for a couple months, it's because the doctors kept putting dirty instruments into his body trying to find the bullet that he gets blood poisoning and dies. You know, and the guy who kills him, his whole defense is, I shot him, but I didn't kill him. The doctors killed him. Which is true.
Really?
Mm-hmm. That's his defense. I mean, he gets executed anyway, but that's his defense. Because it is true. If they would have left the bullets alone, same thing with McKinley. Well, McKinley, they stitched him up and he dies. But if they just would have left it alone, that bullet wouldn't have killed him. It didn't penetrate any organs, but it was them sticking their fingers in there.
Dirty hands and instruments.
It's just interesting to see how medicine is. Thank goodness medicine has come to the point it has today. Otherwise,
you know, we should write a book. How many doctors how many presidents are killed by their doctors? Because I mean, Washington, one.
Oh yeah, Washington. Yeah, if Washington would have listened to the first doctor or whatever instead of the second one, he would have probably made it.
That's so interesting with it that when you talk about Lincoln, because I'll be honest, I don't think I remember learning that how many failures he had, you know, before he finally was elected and kind of again thrust into the national spotlight and became president. I mean, it sounds when you were saying that, I don't know if you guys ever remember, and maybe this was just me in Central California listening to the radio as I'm driving to church every Sunday. But Paul Harvey is an old kind of very famous radio host, and he always used to do those bits called The Rest of the Story, right? And he would talk about someone without naming them and tell all these things. You're like, man, who's this like super interesting person? They're like failing and failing and failing and doing this, that, and the other. And he's like, and then the rest of the story is, and then the next year Abraham Lincoln was, you know, elected president and, you know, led the country through the Civil War and stuff like that. So it sounded like just one of those things. And that's just kind of a little bit like what we talked about before was context.
Yes.
We lose a lot of that context. And that honestly, like, I mean, that's a great example, right? And as a teacher, I'm sure if you're bringing that up, there's probably at least one or two students that'll sink in and like, hey, I don't have to succeed every single time. Look at Abraham Lincoln. Right. And, you know, he failed and failed and failed and failed and then, you know, kind of kept going at it. Thank you, Jared, for being on the History Buzz with us tonight.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And anytime you want to talk again, let me know.
Absolutely.
This was a great conversation. You know,
absolutely.
We're kind of thinking a lot of the same things. And so, well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Talk with History podcast. And please reach out to us at our website, talkwithhistory.com. But more importantly, if you know someone else that might enjoy this podcast, please share this with them, especially if you think that today's topic would interest a friend. Shoot them a text and tell them to look up the Talk with History podcast because we rely on you, our community, to grow, and we appreciate you all every day. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.